So welcome to what I'm sure will be an enlightening evening. So first off, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge that we are on Treaty 1 territory, and the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe peoples and the homeland of the Métis Nation. So some of us have likely come here today because we've heard about a 15-year-old boy who was held in Guantanamo for over 10 years. And others have come here because they've more recently read about a young Winnipeg man who's been imprisoned for supporting the Islamic State online without being charged with a crime. And likely still is that we've come here to hear the words of a man who's dedicated to defending the rights we've seen so harshly violated, and to be reminded that action is possible in the face of adversity. So Dennis Edney is a Canadian defense lawyer based out of Edmonton. He's notably known for his work on the Omar Khadr case. Edney has worked since 2004 on Omar Khadr's defense against charges from the firefight death of a U.S. soldier in 2002. Khadr, who is Canadian, was 15 at the time and has been called a threat to national security and abandoned by his government. So Mr. Edney has received several human rights awards in recognition of his work. It has been speculated that Mr. Khadr might still be at Guantanamo if not for his lawyer's efforts. So I'd like to take a moment to thank this evening's sponsors, Peace Alliance Winnipeg and the Manitoba Association for Rights and Liberties. So after tonight's talk, we will have a question and answer period to which I'd ask you to please keep your questions brief in an effort to allow everyone who would like to ask a question the opportunity to do so. And after the questions, we'll have refreshments that were generously provided by the Islamic Social Services Association. And so with that said, I am honored to welcome Dennis Edney to the microphone.
If I hear any more compliments, I may start to believe them, you know. I'm from a Scottish background where if I had won the Nobel Prize one day, my mother would have said to me, "Don't get carried away with yourself, there's always tomorrow." So, there's a couple of comments I'd like to make before I get lost in my talk to you all. First of all, I want to thank you all for being here. I truly thank you for that. But I also want to thank those who have volunteered and took care of me the last few days and organized all this, and people taking pictures of me all the time and stuff. I want to thank you too. I was speaking to two chaps outside just a few minutes ago, and I was saying to them that I've been joking about the fact that people are so happy to see me. And I've got the hint. I've been saying to people, you know, I feel like John the Baptist. I've been in the desert for years, and all of a sudden I come home to the village and people are glad to see me. And I was trying to understand that, seriously trying to understand that, because I've been wandering through this desert for quite a long time. I've been fighting every challenge put up against me by this Canadian government, and been successful every time. I'm successful in the US Supreme Court, but don't run out and hire me because I lost every pre-trial challenge in Guantanamo Bay, Cuba. But I'm trying to understand why people were so happy about seeing me after all those years. Was the fact that because I felt lonely for years. You know, when you do a journey like Omar Khadr and you do complicated cases like I do, unless it's not easy. And I felt lonely in that journey because, you know, people pass you by. You want the world to believe in what you're doing. You want You want lawyers who are your colleagues to be knocking on your door saying, "Can I help you?" I want to avoid going to my wife once more for money, and so on and so forth. It's a long-winded way of saying, what I realized has happened here is that many, many people in Canada felt that we wouldn't get Omar Khadr out, that you can't defeat power, particularly powerful power in the hands of governments. And the reality is you can. It may not be easy, it may be slow, but you can. And I've lectured on this for years. I've said to little kids and I've said to students, I'm a powerful guy. And then I used to joke, I used to show my muscles, and the big kids didn't get it. You know, they look at this body and think, forget it. Oh, this guy. But I'm just giving that little anecdote tonight before I start, because we are powerful. We are. If we believe in justice, and if we uphold the principles of justice, it's hard to take you down. When you're talking about human dignity, how does someone, unless he's an absolute bigot, argue against you? And the second thing you do then, you do what I do. You make people accountable. You make your politicians accountable. So I'd better stop talking, because I could take you on a different track tonight than what you're here for. The subject matter of Omar Khadr, as I've said on numerous occasions, is so extensive and complex that my talk this evening can't do it any justice. His story touches from the human to the inhuman, from the legal to the illegal. I could simply sum it up by saying I've never met anybody who has been so abused and so abandoned by so many who should know better. In a few months, Omar will turn 29 years of age, having now spent almost half of his life in conditions that raised international condemnation from human rights organizations, from jurists, from the United Nations, and so on, but not by our government. And in my talks, I talk about the right to justice and the entitlement of each and every one of us to protection from inhuman, degrading, abusive treatment, simply because we're human beings. Those principles, I suggest to you, are non-negotiable. It is the core value of a civil society. Yet, it was a memo from the Bush administration that declared that the Geneva Conventions did not apply to allegedly captured terrorists on the battlefield of Afghanistan. The message was loud and clear. The rule of law would not apply to any suspects in the war on terror. And it was that memo that introduced Omar to a life of terror behind the secret walls of Guantanamo Bay. And Guantanamo Bay is simply a place without rules. And it's a place where Omar spent 10 years of his life, where he had been arbitrarily detained, suffered unjust imprisonment, prolonged solitary confinement, torture, and other humiliations. And all the while, our government, through then Foreign Affairs Minister Peter MacKay, persisted in telling each and every one of you here that he has been assured that Omar is being treated humanely and would take the United States at its word. Even though every other Western nation had demanded the release of their detainees in Guantanamo Bay, adults every one of them, and that was granted. International condemnation of Guantanamo Bay in those early days was full of concern about torture. And yet, we are the only government, Western government, never criticized Guantanamo Bay. We simply left a boy, a 15-year-old boy, in a hell. The fact that torture has taken place in Guantanamo and that Omar has been subject to different forms of torture during his 10 years in Guantanamo is simply a matter of public record. It's not something I'm making up. And you only have to look no further than our 2008 Supreme Court of Canada decision stating that the United States had violated the International Convention on Torture and the Geneva Conventions with regards to Omar Khadr, and that Canada had also been complicit in his torture. So I say to you, there can be no greater betrayal of Canadian values and our standing in the international community than our government having been implicated in something so utterly horrible as the torture of a Canadian citizen, a youth at that, Omar Khadr. And when that decision came out, it took me 5 years of climbing up to the Supreme Court of Canada, having gathered all kinds of evidence to demonstrate Canada's complicity in Guantanamo. And when the court agreed with my position, the next day I expected a parade outside the House. And there was no public outrage when the decision came out, and there's been very little outrage since. As a matter of fact, when you hear all the questions in the media, not once do they refer back to the 2008 decision that Canada had tortured one of its own. We, each and every one of us, have never made our government accountable for abandoning our Constitution, sullying our reputation that others fought hard for. We have all become complicit by our very silence. And history tells us there are some cases that enshrine the defining moments of their time. Omar Khadr's case and the war is one. Future generations will rightly judge our shocking dereliction of responsibility in this matter and our collective failure to extend justice and humanity. And as we, all of us, have failed Omar, we have also failed our children through bequeathing to them an uncertain future as a result of systemic apathy by its citizens and our institutions. I say to you, in my sort of dark view of things, Omar's story, to me anyway, provides a frightening lens into the future of democracy and the decline of the rule of law as we see it. And one has to look no further than the story of Guantanamo Bay to understand how easy it is for a nation to fall into lawlessness. It was in January of 2002 that we, many of us here this evening, witnessed on television the first shocking images of prisoners hooded and shackled for transportation across the Atlantic to Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, much as other human beings had been carried in slave ships 400 years ago. And many of those prisoners were described by Human Rights Watch as no more than being farmers and taxi drivers sold by the Northern Alliance to the Americans on the war on terror. And in preparing for that 24-hour trip to Guantanamo, they would be zipped into an orange jumpsuit, hog-chained, meaning they were shackled around their ankles with a waist chain binding their hands to their stomach. And those chains were pulled so tight that many prisoners to this day were still left with the scars. And on the plane, they would be forced into sensory deprivation gear that the US military uses to disorient prisoners prior to interrogation. Opaque goggles covered their eyes, soundproof earphones over their ears and nose, and a mask and a hood over their heads. They were now ready to be bolted, fully trussed to a backless steel bench or lying prone on the floor of a transport plane for the overseas flight. And I recall Omar telling me about his trip. And he said, you know, Mr. Edney, 3 days prior to leaving, we were not given any food and only sips of water. And I later discovered this was to ensure that no detainee would require toilet facilities for the long trip to Cuba. Imagine treating your family pet that way. It wouldn't be long before your neighbour came by and you'd be cited for cruelty to animals. And that's exactly how those human beings were believed to be. They were inhuman. And on arrival in Guantanamo, they'd be dumped onto the tarmac of Guantanamo Airport like so much baggage, to be loaded then into a truck and deposited into wire cages, 6 feet by 6 feet 7, which would be their home for many years, irrespective of the searing heat, the tropical storms. And what we were witnessing was not a manifestation of the Geneva Conventions at work, nor was it an act of deportation or extradition. It was worse. It was far worse. It was the unlawful transportation to a world outside the reach of the law and intended to remain so. And introduced to that life of terror behind those secret walls was a 15-year-old Canadian boy, the only child left in Guantanamo Bay. In fact, I was in New York and I was approached by a representative of Human Rights Watch, and what she said to me was, as I digress, what she said to me was, there were 24 kids in Guantanamo in 2002 picked up and deposited there. And the Bush administration contacted us and asked our assistance in reintegrating these kids back to where they came from. And the only name that wasn't on the table was Omar Khadr. And I asked her why. Why she thought, why would that be? And she said, well, the message is that Canada doesn't care. The government doesn't care. No one stood up for him. So he was left there. And I should say, however, that Omar's story starts much earlier, for those who are not familiar with it. At the age of 12, his father had moved the Khadr family from Toronto to work in Pakistan and then Afghanistan. And when Afghanistan was invaded by the US, the country was in turmoil. Many sought safety in the mountains regions of Pakistan, including the Khadr family. However, Omar's father abandoned him by leaving him in the hands of a small group of Taliban warriors in a compound, promising to return and pick him up, and he never did. And 6 weeks later, the compound was attacked by US forces. It was bombed and reduced to rubble, and Omar was the only survivor. And when this dust settled, a Delta Force soldier going by the pseudonym of OC1, he gave evidence at Omar's so-called trial, stated he saw Omar crouched on his knees, facing a blank wall, screaming from the bombing and shrapnel that had permanently blinded his left eye. And that soldier then shot him twice in the back. And that action in itself constituted a war crime under international law. And 3 days later, and contrary to all expectations, in fact it was a week later, Omar regained consciousness at the US Naval Base Hospital in Bagram, Afghanistan. And whatever horrors went on in Guantanamo started in Bagram. From the moment Omar gained consciousness, little did he realize that his life had changed forever. despite the fact that he was suffering from extensive shrapnel wounds to much of his body, that the bones in his left shoulder and chest were shattered from bullet wounds, or that he was now partially blind. He would be taken into an interrogation room with his hands and feet shackled to a stretcher, leaving him unable to resist the horrors that were soon to be penetrated on him. And all the while, pain medication would be withdrawn in preparation for these sessions. And when his interrogators didn't like the answers were given, Omar would then be forced into stress positions. That is, his injured and pained body would be placed into unnatural positions, which caused an agonizing pain in this young boy, screaming and sobbing uncontrollably. It was then that his captors would then take a bright pencil light and shine it directly into his damaged eyes, causing even more pain and even more damage that he suffers from today. And Damien Corsetti, one of the torturers who participated in that torture, has publicly stated, "We did terrible things to that boy." And he has reached out to Omar on a number of occasions seeking forgiveness. You know, the interrogation team that committed and perpetrated torture in the hospital in Bagram on Omar and others, you know that team. Many of you may remember the pictures of an American soldier smoking, standing on the naked bodies of Muslim human beings in the Abu Ghraib prison. And that was the team that started off in Bagram and did so well in Bagram that they got promoted to Guantanamo, and then from Guantanamo on to Abu Ghraib. And as Omar became, I should tell you more, I should say to you that Sergeant Claus was the leader of this interrogation team. And I may have touched upon it in my talk, but I think it's important to tell you, he was the leader of that team. Damien Corsetti, whom I've met a number of times over the years, when I first met him, he can't stand himself. He was 20 years of age when he was trained to do the interrogations that he did. He can't stand his body. He just shakes all over, and his skin feels like it's coming off. And then in the documentary that I'm in, called "You Don't Wish to Know the Truth," he opens his shirt and he'll show you he's got this big tattoo that says, "I'm a monster." But Sergeant Claus, his leader, was an even greater monster. And I remember dealing with him at the trial in Guantanamo, and he was a hero there, actually. And he was dressed all in black. And he acknowledged that, yes, he may have been a bit more harsh with a young boy than he had been with adults. Think of that kind of human being. It's easier to pick on a child than adults. And as Omar became more mobile, he would be taken into the interrogation room with a black hood placed over his head, intending to disorient him. And Omar described the suffocating feeling he experienced as the hood was wrapped tightly around his neck, nearly choking him. And he would panic, scream out to his interrogators that it was difficult to breathe, and they would just laugh at him as barking, snarling dogs were then brought in the room to further terrify him. It's all about fear. It's all about humiliation. But more significantly, for me anyway, he would be made to stand on his toes in a crucifix position for hours at a time, with his arms outstretched to the upper parts of a door jamb and hung by the wrists. So eventually, supporting your weight becomes an unbearable strain. And his ankles and feet would swell twice to their size. Moving became agonizing. And while in these positions, this young Omar would urinate on himself. And that was the best time for the team. Because he would then be untied, and he would use his head as a floor mop to clean up the urine, while at the same time he would be threatened with rape and other humiliating acts, which I don't care to describe any further. You know, I questioned the chief nurse of the background ward that Omar was in, and she said nothing went on there, nothing at all. And then we had a former US Army medic who contacted us and wanted to give evidence at the trial. Of course, he wasn't permitted to be there because Omar had no witnesses at his trial. And he stated that he once found Omar Khadr chained to the door frame of a 5-foot square wire cage with his arms suspended above his shoulders, hooded and weeping. Imagine that frightening picture of a 15-year-old boy. Imagine your own child, your own brother, your own sister. It's just unbelievable. It's evil. And another technique would be, it was called the night shift, where Omar would walk up and down the hallways throughout the night carrying buckets of water in each hand. And on reviewing the few medical notes that we were able to get, a nurse noted that his wounds would weep and would seep with blood during this activity. And we're talking about a 15-year-old Dan. And a former British detainee who was in Guantanamo, and then his government had him released, and whom I interviewed, said, "We could hear Omar's cries and moans day and night until we were separated from him. And we all felt bad for him because he was just too young." And I particularly recall the story Omar tells me of the US soldier who would come to his bedside regularly in that hospital. He would then drop his pants, stick his naked bum in Omar's face, and then fart. And people would laugh. Nurses, soldiers would laugh. And so imagine, I've always thought of hospitals as a sacred place, a place where humanity is shown, a place of healing. And we turned that hospital was nothing more than an evil place. And I've told you that during this time, Omar's principal interrogator at the Bagram Hospital was Sergeant Joshua Claus. You could check him out. Check him out on the internet. Check him out on Google. He questioned Omar over a 3-month period for up to 6 hours at a time. And Claus later pled guilty to killing to killing one detainee in Bagram and crippling 2 others, using the same techniques that he used on Omar, except he's a bit rougher on Omar. And in his defense, he said that he felt he pressured to get results. But the government did a deal. He didn't go to prison. The government had him, they gave him immunity so that he could testify at Omar's trial that Omar confessed to him that he had thrown a hand grenade at Sergeant Claus. It's unbelievable, the irony of that. When Omar Khadr was interviewed, gave his press conference, he was asked about, did you throw a hand grenade? And he said, I don't know. Because he's so truthful. He didn't know. Because from the moment he gained consciousness, and through the years, as they do to each and every detainee, they force the answers that they want. And Omar knew what they wanted eventually, because they told him, you killed Sergeant Claus, you killed Sergeant Claus. To the point Omar had to acknowledge that because he knew more pain was coming when he didn't. And Omar described The predominant sound in that hospital ward were the cries of pain from others being abused and tortured. It was just a few days ago that before I came out here, I was on the phone speaking to this human rights organization called Cage in London, run by former Guantanamo detainees. And I was explaining how Omar was doing. And they then were talking about how they were doing. And they talked about some of their abuses. And I've been on this road a long time. But I found myself, my eyes welling up. I found I was going to cry. And so I said, look, I'll have to call you back. So I say to you, it goes against the very core of humanity that torture and abuse of anyone, let alone a 15-year-old, would take place in a hospital where people are at their most vulnerable. And whatever horrors he experienced in the Bagram hospital followed him to Guantanamo Bay. And they included beatings, humiliation, sleep deprivation, and so on and so on and so on and so on. And I recall my first meeting with Omar, because he had been moved from the cages to one of the secret prisons in Guantanamo. You know of the cages, but we don't publicize that there are 3 secret prisons in Guantanamo, big concrete prisons, blocks in the desert, which the Pentagon says designed for enhanced interrogation techniques, namely torture. And I won't go on too much about Omar anymore, but I would say to you that when I saw Omar Khadr, I was shocked at the sight of this tragic, lonely figure. He reminded me of a small, broken bird all curled up into himself. And I recall the involuntary gasp at the sight of him, that I had such difficulty in controlling my emotions. I was supposed to be the adult, I was supposed to be the lawyer, and I wanted to find someone to speak to, someone to hug me, someone to tell me what was going on there. Because I was a father and could not believe what I was seeing. I had young children, and I knew they were in the comfort and safety and security of my wife. And so that first image of Omar haunted me for years. This so very dejected, lonely figure abandoned by all. And every time I left Omar after a visit, I was aware that the fluorescent lights in his cell would remain on 24 hours a day, that he would try to sleep the time away, and that the cold in his cell would prevent sleep, and that incessant lighting had divested him of his feel for night and day. And throughout my numerous years of visiting him in Guantanamo Bay, I never ever saw him walking, as he was always shackled to the floor. I grew up with Omar Khadr sitting on a chair and him sitting on a stool. And he was just a young boy, now he's a big tall man, bigger than myself. You know, in looking at the military dossier records, demonstrate as a result of the unrelenting maltreatment of Guantanamo detainees, there were several hundred suicide attempts. And this, in the documents also stated a high percentage of detainees are on antidepressants. And the report also indicated that at least 100 have become observably mentally ill as opposed to just being depressed. So Omar is often referred by our government as a terrorist who committed a heinous crime, who pleaded guilty to those charges. He does so without any backdrop leading to the plea bargain. The American military tribunal in Guantanamo Bay that convicted Omar was not a normal court. It was a pantomime of justice, removed from the normal American legal system and relying on made-up rules and novel legal interpretations. Some would say a kangaroo court, one worthy of a Middle Eastern dictatorship or a Kafkaesque story. Or as the Alberta Court of Appeal put it recently, in dryly damning language, the legal process under which Carter was held and the evidence elicited from him have been found to have violated both the Charter and international human rights law. And you know, the Supreme Court of Canada said also as much, which flies in the face of the constant language from our government and from Mr. Blenny, who keeps saying the same two lines without any backdrop. And whatever I'm telling you here, they know. In Guantanamo, every time we had a hearing, officials from the Department of Foreign Affairs were present. I would speak to them. I recall one time saying to an official from the Department of Foreign Affairs, if we don't get him out of one of those secret prisons, he's going to die. And she said, I know. And before he pled guilty, he made it clear that he didn't want to do so. He said to me that Canadians would think that he is a terrorist. And I said, not at all. Canada, when they get to see you, hear you, will see a different person. Well, you saw him recently, but in the 2 years he's been here, the Canadian government has fought all the way to make sure you don't get to see him or hear him. And on his return to Canada, he didn't get to see the Canadian public because Mr. Taze, who was a former minister, seems to have a problem reading documents. Because I sent him documents from the Pentagon and from the judge advocate in Guantanamo that expressed that he was nothing more than a good kid. But Mr. Tate's eyesight can't be that good because he read it in a different kind of way. Because he determined that Omar Khadr was a security risk to Canada and to any prisoner in any maximum security prison. And because of that, we located him in Millhaven, where Bernardo and other people were there. And we locked him up for 7.5 months in solitary confinement. And on the day he was released into the prison population, an inmate attempted to stab him and then placed a contract on his life. So I was then able to secure his transfer to a maximum security prison in Edmonton. And on arrival, he was placed on a white supremacist unit, the only Muslim. And within minutes, he was assaulted. And I recall that terrible, terrible day for me. It was the worst day in all my years with Omar. I met a very sad and frightened Omar. Up and until in Guantanamo, he had kept himself together. He'd come back here with hope. And here he was crying to me. And I remember the reality that I faced then, that I couldn't do anything. I couldn't take him out. I couldn't take him home with me. I had to send him back up those stairs, back to those idiots that were waiting for him. In chronicling Omar's ordeal, I'm not simply describing shameful and appalling behaviour towards a young Canadian youth that should shock the conscience of all of us, or that he has managed against all odds to maintain an enduring faith in our common humanity, or that his truth has been able to leap prison walls and barriers. It is all of that. It is only by creating a climate of fear that it is easy for people to accept, such as ourselves, that drastic measures must be taken in the interest of security, even if it means the suspension of civil liberties, compromising our values, or ignoring the rule of law. We rationalize it's for the greater good of society. It is then that we fall into lawlessness. So as I conclude, our generation has had the most sophisticated development of international laws, treaties and conventions the international community has ever known, all stating that human rights abuses will not be tolerated. And these international conventions include the Geneva Conventions, the Convention on Torture, the Convention on the Rights of the Child, and many, many more, all applicable to Omar Khadr, and all denied him. As a result of the international consensus reflected in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the Charter of the United Nations, that no one in the future would fall outside the protection of the law, has been overridden and supplanted by lawlessness. We only have to look at that hellhole, Guantanamo Bay, that still exists. And as a signatory to all these international treaties, our government has an obligation to protest when they are not being applied to one of its citizens. And not once did it complain to the Americans about its obligations under international law to Omar Khadr. Canada, which is us, which was once viewed as a leader in human rights and upholding the rule of law, is now responsible for undermining those very protections. So Omar's story provides a frightening lens into the future of democracy and the decline of the rule of law as we knew it. Because his story is not just about a young boy who was detained and abused. His story is also about how we as individuals define ourselves as a society and what we are prepared to stand up for. And if this could happen to a 15-year-old Canadian youth, then tell me, assure me, how could any one of us, including our children, ever feel safe? And so I've given you the harsh treatment, the reality. And so I was asked outside a question, had I lost faith? Not at all, ladies and gentlemen, not the slightest. I have seen such humanity from one end of Canada to the other. When I started off, I kind of mumbled about what it all meant about this bail hearing. What this bail hearing meant for Canada was that we can, even a simple guy like myself from Dundee and Edmonton, Alberta, if I can take, and my co-counsel Nate Whitland can take on big governments and be successful, then so can any of you. I was no international lawyer. I'm a former carpenter, former truck driver, lawyer. You know, let's see what I put them all. But I just felt that a situation was imposed upon me that I could not walk away. How could I walk away from that child and live with myself? And it didn't matter whether I won or not. What was important, that I took those steps. That's what's important. We stand up and let people know that we stand up for justice. The word justice I use almost like a religious term, even though I'm far from being religious. That's my wife. She complains I don't go to church with her. Justice is a beautiful word because it does away with barriers. It does away with different religious organizations. It does away with color. And what it dresses you in is power. Because how can you take me on? You, Mr. Government, for example. When I'm talking about fundamental principles of humanity, how do you argue against that? You can't. So I thank you very much for listening to me. One other point then is that I have had over 1,000 emails in the last few weeks, with the exception of one email. Everyone says, thank you, Mr. Edney. And the other part is, we feel better as Canadians. I live in this pretty conservative area where most of my neighbours are Jewish, and I think you have to be a doctor to get into the area. And I hardly ever see my neighbours. But you know, since Omar's release, my neighbours have knocked on the door to bring cake, to bring food, to provide flowers, to welcome Omar home. And if you watched the press conference, there were some neighbours shouting at the end of the press conference, "Welcome Omar." And Omar has been welcomed by all kinds of Canadians. My wife was in West Edmonton Mall, and some chap was buying ice cream, and he saw Omar, and he bought Omar a cone. I was at Omar in Home Hardware, and this big bruiser, I don't know how old he was, about 50-ish, he looked pretty rough, looked at me with an evil eyes. He went by me, and then he turned around, bypassed me, walked right up to Omar, and said, "You're Omar." He says, "You know, I don't like Americans. I don't like what they did to you, and I wish you the best." So, no matter where he is turned, people are not intrusive, but they want to send a message to him. We're glad you're here. Thank you very much.
So we'll take a few questions if you're ready. So we have a microphone here and one over here, so we can form lines if anyone has something to ask. All right, we'll start over here.
So my question for you was, do you think that you could have set a draft for a new legal precedent when dealing with alleged terrorists?
Could I have done a what? I'm sorry.
Do you think that you could have set a draft for a new legal precedent when dealing with alleged terrorists through this case?
No. It's when you're making a determination, when you're dealing in terrorism, for example, and I've been involved in terrorism for years, the rule of law always applies. It's not a utilitarian analysis of what's best for the many against the rights of the few. That goes against the whole basis of justice. We want to ensure that we send a message to anybody who has committed harm in society that we are human and that we'll provide you with justice, but you, as part of that justice, you need to go to prison. But when they don't follow the law and we don't follow the law, then we're all in this. Then we're no different. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll take a question over here.
Sorry, I'm having trouble because unfortunately I've read a lot of history, and for almost a decade now I've been using a word that describes exactly the obscenities like Victave and the other people from the Conservative Party of Canada, led by the terrorist of all terrorists, Stephen Harper. I've been using the word fascism and fascist because what has happened in Canada in the last 10 years parallels on so many levels what took place in Germany as good people. German people are good people, you know. They have families, they have kids, and they did before World War II. And they were good people, but they were apathetic and they were lied to and they were manipulated just as we have. And yet I've been taken to task for using the word fascism. But that is the society we live in today. That is the reality we live in today. And I thank you for giving us some of the minute details of one of the aspects of fascism in our country today. And I'm so happy you came. Thank you.
Thank you for that. We're in agreement. If one looks at the civil society that was Germany pre-Second World War, I would suggest to you it's far more sophisticated than we were. He had a parliamentary system, not the parliamentary system where we have, where there's no debate, where there's omnibus bills, no one leads, and we scream and shout at each other. And then Germany had all kinds of arts and literature and freedom of religion, and a powerful police force and the judiciary. All those civil institutions we have today. And so I'm not here to give a history lesson, but there is a parallel. And the parallel is apathy is a virus. It's an evil. Unless you stand up and let people know what you stand for, as I earlier said, that you stand up for justice, equality, humanity, then we'll have bills like C-51. If we think Bill C-51 is bad, wait till Harper gets elected in the next election. I can't keep track of the bills that have come out, considering the crime rate's gone down for the last 13 years. Thank you very much.
Thank you. We'll take a question over here next.
So despite the Geneva Convention, time and time again, we've seen the U.S. get away with human rights violations. We saw it in Vietnam with their use of chemical warfare in Agent Orange. So my question is, because the U.S. seems to get away with it almost every single time, how do we as Canadians, I guess, how can we mobilize to kind of hold them to account?
We have to hold ourselves to account. I hear this all the time, not what your particular very good question, but I hear what I do. And what you do is, this is your society. Actually, I would tell you, if I were to start again, I wouldn't be speaking to adults. I'd be speaking to kids. I'd be sending them home to talk to their parents to make sure they did something. It's up to us to decide the kind of society we want. You know the kind of society you want. When you're living in your street and your kids are playing outside, you want them to be safe. You want them to have good values. That's the kind of society we are. And when we're not getting it, then we've got to get off our bum and talk to our politicians and talk to our neighbours. And if our politician isn't going to do what we want, then why not have a little hobby of knocking on every door in the neighbourhood to say, vote against this guy?
Thank you. Next question over here.
Niin, I just want to, I don't have a question, I just came here to give you a gift. When I heard you were coming, it's a gift, it's a little medicine drum and a buffalo on it, and a feather. There's some medicine in there which we believe will protect you on your endeavors from here on in.
Thank you. Over to the next question.
By chance, I happened to read last year a little book by a Scottish minister. I think he was Church of Scotland. He had spent the 1930s, here in Winnipeg, and had been sent by his church to France for the Second World War years, where he acted like the Scarlet Pimpernel and was part of an underground movement to rescue Allied forces that were behind lines and get them back to where they could fight again. And of course he was caught, and he detailed the tortures that he himself and others went through at the hand of the SS. And the only one that was similar was carrying buckets of water by wounded soldiers and prisoners all night long. And as you described, the wounds weeping, it was the same in this book. All the other tortures sound like a picnic next to what you've described here this evening. I'm not shocked, because I did know before, but reassaulted in my senses that this should happen to a child. This should happen to anyone. That we should be complicit in this in any way, shape, or form. And like you said, it's time to knock on doors and get rid of our own little Nazi. And take down the rest. It is time we got off our television sets and the internet and stopped playing in our gardens, you know, with our weed killer, and did something before we don't have any land for the Métis, like myself, or the rest of the Aboriginal people, or any of the rest of you, because this is a horrible situation. And I'm sorry it was a statement, not a question. I have 1,000 questions for you, but I just think you're...
Thank you. Thank you very much. You know, one of the things I should say about torture is, contrary to people's beliefs, that if one got tortured, that person's going to come after you with a gun, sail across the ocean, climb into your house and shoot you. I heard all that kind of language when I would be in the United States under the Bush administration, as I made my way from Edmonton to Guantanamo. I had all the language of fear. But the reality of torture victims, and I've met, unfortunately, quite a few, is that they find a humanity that we don't understand. I was in Argentina and dealing with the chief prosecutor of Buenos Aires, and he's putting up military junta to trial, and during the dirty wars down there's a great deal of torture took place. So, you know, I met a Nobel Peace Prize winner who had been tortured. I met all kinds of people who had been tortured, and they say the same thing that Omar Khadr said in Guantanamo, is I never want to see anybody harmed like me. Because I remember saying to Omar in Guantanamo years ago, so what do you want to do when I get you out of here? And Omar said, I want to be a doctor. And I said, why? I thought you want to be a lawyer. And he said, because I want to make sure that no one is ever harmed. And if you listen closely to his press conference, he made a comment about how he has experienced, he played it very quietly, but he said, I've experienced pain. And so the human condition is beautiful and puzzling. How out of hell you can become a better person. I can only give you the example of myself, although my wife may stand up and tell you I'm a bit of a pain to live with and she'd be telling lies. My journey has made me more compassionate, not bitter. My journey has made me feel a better person about myself. I really feel that standing up for someone on the street who falls and helps and picks him up, and someone who needs help, makes me a better person. And so I have been blessed with the people like yourselves that I've met. People like yourselves that have come in here, expressed your feelings, left your house. The human family is beautiful. We don't see it often enough, but it's beautiful. Thank you.
Over here.
So I happened to watch the press conference on TV when yourself and Mr. Khadr were standing in your driveway, and it really struck me just how intelligent Mr. Khadr was, because it's the first time anyone has really seen him, apart from what propaganda has given us. And he came across as intelligent, compassionate, understanding. humorous. And I'm just wondering, since he's been out, since he's been with you, and in all the time that you've known him, perhaps what piece of wisdom do you think he's disclosed to you about how to deal with all he's gone through, and that maybe that wisdom that you could pass on to all of us on how to deal with people in authority that don't treat others with respect? How do you deal with that?
I don't know what he would say, to be honest. I can't speak for him. I think that I've talked to you about how you take on power. You don't allow people to misuse you or abuse you. But think less about being picked on and think more about helping. That's the better way of phrasing the question. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. And then next over here.
Hi, I'm a little overwhelmed, so I may stumble. One of the things which kind of stood with me when in the press conference when Omar was released is that you mentioned something and that Harper hates Muslim, and you said that out of your experience dealing with Omar's case. And me as a young Muslim who chose Canada to be his home and who is passionate and opinionated and in so many ways, I live with a constant fear in a sense, and considering now the new bills after Bill C-51, the C-24, where I can be effectively kicked out of Canada for saying something wrong, liking something wrong on Facebook, or anything which they can make up and get away with. So I don't know, do I want a reassurance from you as our, how do you see the future of, and specifically Muslim Canadian youth, who are usually the target group in these kind of bills, and to reassure myself that I made the right choice coming to this place, you know? And in the second question would be probably related to it, is that you are one guy, as you said, you are one guy. How many, and you fought one guy, a case of one guy, and there would be, considering this bill coming into effect, there would be many victims, not to the degree of Omar Khadr, but there would be many degree of Bill C-51. Do you see in the lawyers community with skills and with potentials people who would defend?
I think I'm going to be asked that question at the end. So I'll answer your first question. First of all, you owe me a lot of money. Seriously. I've spoke about protecting the Muslim community for years. The Muslim community, unfortunately, has been apathetic in responding to the tax on it. And you know that. And there's an excuse for that. You know, when you arrive in a country as a new immigrant, you know, you don't want to stand up and be seen. You want to just assimilate. It's the same as Omar. Omar's got, he doesn't want to be on TV or radio, or he just wants to go on his bicycle. The difficulty is that, based upon statistics for 2013 that I read in the Winnipeg Free Press just a few days ago, that racial attacks have gone down for the vast population of Canada, but gone up 43% in terms of attacks on Muslims. And so why is that? It is because we have allowed to form part of our everyday dialogue that Muslims are terrorists, and if they're not terrorists, they know somebody who is a terrorist. I gave a talk years ago in San Francisco, and I was tired, and I was speaking to judges and lawyers and public, and I started off by saying, you know, all Muslims are terrorists. So it looked at me kind of strange. And if they're not terrorists, they know somebody who is a terrorist. And by then, I think they were looking for someone to throw me out. And I said, but it doesn't really matter because they're going to become terrorists. And then I challenged them to tell me, didn't they not feel better being white, Caucasian, Anglo-Saxon, good Christian kind of guy? Because the language of fear is in Canada today reminds me of the worst days in America under Bush. You hear it every day. In fact, we now don't talk, the Prime Minister doesn't talk about Muslims because we love you. We talk about Islamicism. I've never heard that phrase, but Islamicism justifies sending our troops into Iraq and Syria, justifies legislation. It's just cover for Muslims. And so it's ridiculous, it's frightening, and it's, as this gentleman was saying, you compared Nazi Germany to now, it's the same creeping language and it was there about Jews. I've seen videos, old videos of German movies showing rats in a cellar, and you were supposed to see a Jew as a rat in a cellar. So what do you do about that? You stand up and you fight. You fight intelligently. You write letters, you speak to your mosques, you get them to challenge their mosques, and churches have failed us. Because they are communities like we are here tonight that have huge bodies of people that come to them. And their votes. And who has knocked on a PC, a Conservative Party door and say, look, my mosque has 1,400 people and we're not going to vote for you unless you stand up and speak for Muslims and stop talking in a racist manner and creating Islamophobia. I'm just saying, I can't give you the answers. I could tell you that we are a good country and you couldn't be better placed. That's my view. I've just discussed to you how our court system has been brilliant. Guantanamo was just a tragedy of law, a failure of law. Our court system has been brilliant for Omar Khadr, for justice, for people. Your neighbours are all here. We just have to make sure that our human dignity is expressed in a way of saying enough of this way of the media betraying us, the same lines. You just have to stand up. It's worth fighting for. Sorry.
Thank you.
Thank you. Next question over here.
First of all, thank you so much for coming and for doing what you are doing. My name is Guillermo. It's a simple question. I came as a refugee around 8 years ago from Colombia. And maybe for you, I don't know, this situation, this case is new, maybe no. No, it's difficult to say that because I don't know. My question is, do you think this case, this experience, can have implications for another cases in case of Latin America that we are fighting against the powers, particularly against the mining power international companies? That is not new for us. And many people in our countries, in Central and South America, and experiences this kind of things, this kind of the wars, or the kind of experiences that you describe with this person. Thank you so much.
Thank you. The answer is yes. Not only have I had emails from Canadians, I've had emails from all around the world. Not from South America, but certainly Europe. But I had, in speaking with the chief prosecutor of Buenos Aires, for example, he was interested in my cases. And so so we would discuss how my approach to challenging law was about. But not only that, what I said to him, I have this huge network that I have developed, become involved in for years now. You know, I can speak to lawyers in different countries. I speak to some pretty bright people in different places, in New York or wherever. And so I'm part of a legal group that we share information all the time. And I encouraged him to contact those particular people, like the Centre for Constitutional Law in New York, like others in Britain, who do all kinds of work. And you won't feel alone. And so the message should be that you're not alone, that we all have troubles. Colombia and South America and other Africa, there are some particular horrible situations. But yes, I hope, I never thought about it until a few days ago, that what it meant, this victory of getting Omar Khadr out. I was just so focused on getting Omar Khadr out. I now realize the message has resonated everywhere. Power, excess power, has been defeated. You know? So there's hope from that. There's no answers, but there's hope. Thank you.
Hi, my name's Les. Thanks for coming.
Excuse me a minute. Les, I want to bring my wife up here. Please go ahead, Les.
Thank you. I was a bit of a fence sitter till I came tonight. Didn't Martin Luther King say something like, our lives begin to end when we remain silent on things that matter? And my question to you is going to be this. Back a few years ago, didn't the media release Mandela? And where was the media here? What was happening? Is it being silenced? It took you to get it out in constitutional law to get him free, but where was the media in this? That I feel I've been let down that way.
I can't say that I feel that same way. Although I can say that the depiction of Omar Khadr constantly of being convicted as a terrorist without the media talking about, because there was world media present, of what Guantanamo stood for. None of the press has talked about the fact that no torture evidence was permitted in that court. No one has talked about the fact that the first judge got fired because he was threatening the US government to shut down the process because there was no disclosure being given and no documents dealing with Omar's interrogations were provided. And no witnesses were allowed to come in on behalf of Omar Khadr. Just an empty courtroom, one-sided fence. So I could say to you, yes, on one hand, the media have let us down, and I know people who have written letters and challenged editors about how they are portraying that story. But there have been, for example, Michelle Shepherd of the Toronto Star is a hero in my view, because she's been able to keep the Omar Khadr story in the paper for years. Remember, unfortunately, if you have someone going to a school and commit a desecration, that's news that lasts for a week. Then we move on in this day and age. And then there has been Colin Perko of the Globe, of the, thank you, dear. And so on, there have been others. So it's a balance. On one hand, you're correct, and on the other hand, there have been those who have been very good at least keeping his name in the media. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'm sure we've figured out the system by now.
Hi. I do have a question for you, but I also have a couple of things to say. And first of all, I'd like to thank our hosts for providing this space for dialogue. As many of you have mentioned, it's important that we stand up and speak out. You know, there's an old verse, the quote that said, you know, first they came for Group Y and I wasn't part of Group Y. Yeah, I think you all know that. 2 years ago, there was a panel discussion in this place. It was Idle No More, the Green Party, and the Peace Alliance. There was a woman in the audience who stood up and spoke, and she said she was so disturbed about what was happening with our democracy that she had gone to Ottawa to find out for herself, and that when she got there, her MP refused to see her because he said, her MP at the time was Vic Taves, and he said she was a security threat. Well, now Mr. Taves is a crown judge here in Manitoba. Bill C-51 has passed. I don't know who that woman was, but if I was in her shoes, I think I'd be pretty scared. So it is important to stand up and speak. And one of the questions I have to ask you is that I've been listening to this story and read this story, and I'm trying to understand. There was a firefight. There were soldiers involved in a firefight. Even if this 15-year-old kid had thrown a grenade, how is that breaking international law? How is that a war crime? I don't understand that.
It is not a war crime. And pretty soon you'll hear that, hopefully on behalf of Omar Khadr. We filed an argument in the military commission in Guantanamo. I should tell you, by the way, that I was saying this to someone earlier, to digress. I was saying to someone earlier that my mother used to tell me I should be ashamed of myself for my behavior. I don't know what that was, but you have to ask her. But I've never been ashamed of myself as a lawyer until I participated in that sham trial at Guantanamo Bay. And so the judge in Guantanamo, the second judge appointed in Guantanamo, that didn't know the law, didn't care about law. And we argued that those charges would not recognize international law of war charges. Since then, in the last year, and we filed a brief to appeal Omar's convictions. And that brief has been left in a cupboard at the Military Commission, getting dust because the Military Commission hasn't moved on. And all I care is they say I'm right or wrong, makes no difference to me because I'm waiting to get into the federal court system in the United States. But there have been 3 previous detainees now I've made that same argument in the federal court of the United States, and that argument has been upheld. And just recently by you all, BHUL, the court agreed that these charges in Guantanamo in dealing with him, and some of those charges were what Omar was convicted of, were not law of war charges. So all I'm waiting to do is to get into the federal court system and hope to have the same vindication for Omar that these 3 other detainees had. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your talk tonight and also for putting the charge back to us. Nobody has paid me to get up here and make this commercial, but I would like to follow up on the more general comment of the woman over there. This is sponsored by the Manitoba Association for Rights and Liberties. It's one of only 2 or 3 provincial societies in Canada. BC has one, I don't know if there are others. And then there's the Canadian Civil Liberties Association. They're all attempting to do the things you're trying to get us to do. And I would doubt that 10% of the people here tonight belong to either the CCLA or tomorrow. And so I hope that what you've exemplified tonight urges some of the people here to join these much needed, important, central associations to the protection of rights and liberties in Canada. They have very small memberships, oddly enough, and we are living in a time when, as you've been saying, and everybody's been saying tonight, when we need them. So I hope people will sign up on the way out.
question over here.
Thank you for that comment. It was a we were going to address that later because I was going to be asked, I'd set myself up to be asked a particular question about how do we get the tools to make the changes that we're talking about. And as organizations such as what you've talked about, that are essential and more. And I worked with BC Civil Liberties in the Supreme Court of Canada, or they've worked with me in the Supreme Court of Canada. It's organizations, legal organizations, who are able to take on these big constitutional challenges in the betterment of society is where you couldn't put better money towards. That's what we need. Thank you.
An earlier questioner mentioned Mandela. When Omar was on your driveway that day, similar experience to February of 1990 when Mandela came out of prison. Because we had for decades, and I'm old enough to be able to say decades, seen images of Mandela as a terrorist, as a demon, as portrayed by the apartheid regime. And then on that day, this elderly, gentle man came out of prison, and he became human. And so that day on your driveway, Omar Khadr began to become human to us. And Patricia, thank you for joining your husband on stage. And so my question, the question about media, the CBC documentary with him was another powerful vehicle for humanizing Omar Khadr. But I'd like to give you, Mrs. Edney, because you had enormous courage to open your door and invite him into your family. This is shifting gears a little bit, but if without betraying privacy and all that, just tell a story or two of what having Omar as your boy in the house is like.
Okay. Well, thank you for your comment. I don't feel like it took courage to welcome Omar into our home. For the last 12 years, he's been very much a part of our life. Every time we've had a big family dinner, I've wished that one other face was around the table. So when he did get home, it just felt like he got home. And that didn't take any courage, it just took a bit of patience. So, and you know, a few little anecdotes about having Omar around. It's truly wonderful. It's an honor. It's an honor to be able to watch him unfold a little bit, as it were. You know, he is having to get accustomed to the whole idea of being able to be independent as much as he is within the conditions of his bail. But he is a pleasure. He's an absolute pleasure. He is fun to be around. He's got a great sense of humor. As a matter of fact, one anecdote I'd share with you, it actually happened before Omar was released. Maybe last summer, Dennis was out mowing the lawn, and Omar had called from Bowden, and I took the call, and I said, you know, Dan, you know, it's Omar on the call. And he said, tell Omar to get over here and mow the lawn. And Omar said to me, tell him if I had a good lawyer, I would. Can I go now?
Way back there.
He's a good lawyer.
Next question. I think we have maybe time for maybe one or two more questions.
I'm speaking personally, and then I'll have a question. From the very beginning of the story of Omar Khadr, I felt it wrong. And every time the CBC picked up a report, which they did relatively frequently and faithfully, I was able to have that sense enhanced, and my prayer, which we've shared all that time, sustained. And I want to say the CBC did a good job, a really good job, about keeping us aware of the injustice and the horror of that life and the need for us to be doing something. We prayed. That's one thing. The other thing is, in your view, Vic Taves announced in February 2012 that Canada would endorse information obtained by torture. Have they renounced that?
Not at all.
Thank you.
Not at all.
And the last question.
Hello, thanks for being here. I found it interesting that you said that you still have a lot of faith in the justice system. I was wondering if you could explain why you still do, because it is, after all, the Conservatives who have been in power for so many years, and they get to appoint judges to various levels of court. They tried to appoint Mark Nadon, who is the only judge who dissented against Omar Khader, and Vic Taves is a judge across the street today. So why do you still have faith in the justice system?
Well, it took a lawyer called Rocco Galati who just caught us in the car just a couple of days ago, and I've worked with Rocco to take that challenge on. The Vic Taves of the world and the appointees by government, we have no control over. But I could tell you that starting at the Supreme Court level, the Supreme Court has rejected a huge number of non-charter compliant legislations passed by Parliament. And they have done a sterling job, time after time after time. And of course, Harper challenged the reputation of Justice McLaughlin. And so the legal bar put that issue to an international group of jurists who wrote a letter to Harper asking him to apologize. And these jurists, about 40 of them, and they talked about our judicial system as outstanding. And they asked Mr. Harper to apologize. Mr. Harper did not respond. And then some newspaper reporter contacted the government to ask what they were going to do, and they said, well, we've received the letter and that's all we're going to say. Judges have to be courageous. Judges have to make decisions that they know at times they may not be following the government's way or the community's way. There are judges that I could sit down and tell you I never want to go before. And I've been in law a long time, unfortunately, since I look at my age. But I remember when I was starting off, a judge said to me, there are certain judges that you have an obligation to fall down the stairs before you go before. Human condition always has some, we're not perfect, and we have people you never want to go before. But the overall approach by our judicial system, in my view, is brilliant. We don't have elected judges like you have in the States, so we pander to who's ever voted for them. And so I think we should be privileged. And I'm the beneficiary of that. Omar Khader is the beneficiary of that. It sounds so boastful to say this, as a criminal lawyer, you can't win all your cases. The American talk was, I've never lost a case. Well, I don't know if you've ever done a case. You have to lose cases, But I haven't lost a case against a government. Every time I go into court, there's at least 3 lawyers paid for by the taxpayer. And I'm not asking, I'm asking the judges to expand the law, the charter, the constitution extraterritorially to someone who's in another country. And they've come through time and time and time and time again. And then time and time again, even in Alberta, the most conservative court of appeal in the land, it said that Omar Khadr should have been treated as a juvenile. And the government appealed that too. So I think you should have faith in our judiciary. Thank you. One more question.
Quick one.
So we'll do, I don't want to leave you hanging.
Really
so,
quick.
Yeah, the last question.
Thank you very much for defending the rights of Omar Khadr and all you've done. One of the other themes, I think, of that, the story that you're reflecting with us tonight is how incarceration is being used to suppress dissent. And I think in Canada, we have to look really critically at our own history to recognize that we've done a lot of that. If I can point out that Wednesday, the 17th of June, it was 96 years ago that in the middle of the night, 9 homes were raided in this city, and it was the general strike leaders that were imprisoned because they were standing up for collective bargaining rights and a living wage. And we've interred Ukrainians, we've interred the Japanese, we've used that in many ways. Currently, and I would hope in my question, if you and Mr. Carter would be willing to stand up for the Aboriginal population in our prisons today. Because I think in some ways, when it's 70% of the population in our prisons are Aboriginal, that's not an issue of criminality, that's a sociological issue. And it's way that our state is suppressing the needs of Aboriginal people. So if you, as he, I'm sure, is going to become an advocate, there's an area that he could very eloquently speak on.
If there's, I mean, our prisons are a disaster. I know that because I've never been I have never had to deal with pro boards and wardens and ever until Omar Khadr. I represent you. If you go to jail, that's it. Get another lawyer after that. What we're seeing, of course, is that there was a time when you can have a parole hearing every 6 months. Now it's every 2 years. And although we are even although the crime rate has gone down for the past 13 years, we're locking more people up. And those we're locking up are people that I used to represent who were always in trouble for some kind of minor offense. And what would happen was I'd do a deal, as many lawyers did, with the prosecutor that said, okay, you stole that car, that's the 3rd time you stole that car, you're getting 90 days. And so we'd have this agreement, and then we'd put that before the judge, and we'd have this little silent conspiratorial arrangement where the judge, without talking to him, where the judge would then give him 90 days, agree that he could serve his time on weekends, and then order him to hand his paycheck over to his wife on a Friday, then come down to the remand centre, be locked up for the weekend, and be out in time to go to work on Monday. And so the wife and the kids got the money and they got freedom and peace from the husband. That's how we saw it. Now that judges are not allowed that discretion. And one could go on and on and on. All I've done, all I can say is, like many of you here tonight, I have seen the changing face of this country in so many ways that people probably don't even realize that you brought up the prison system. That makes me most unhappy. And so I'm prepared to go to church. I'm not like my wife, I don't go to church, but I am prepared to go to church if I get Mr. Harper out.
Thank you again.
Hold on. But seriously, if there are any newspaper reporters here, please don't quote that.
All right, so I'd just like to invite Glenn Michaelchuk to the stage for a few last words.
Thank you. I mean, you heard Dennis explain his work, and it's all been at tremendous personal cost to him. I mean, it is true that he's defended Omar Khadr pro bono, but that doesn't mean there are no costs with all this immense legal work. So my role up here is to ask you to the meeting's been very successful in terms of the attendance and the money that we've raised tonight. But there is much more that needs to be done, and this cost up till now has been entirely borne by Dennis Edney. And there has been continuous fundraising, and there will continue to do fundraising. But as you leave tonight, we're going to start to circulate some baskets. If you can throw in any contributions further, that would be most appreciated. If you want to make out checks, they can be made out simply to Dennis Edney, because that's where all the costs of the legal defense lie. And or if you leave later, there's someone out front who can do it there for you, collect some money. So thank you very much for attending. A most successful evening. And tell everyone now about the last part with the food.
Okay, so there's some samosas and other refreshments.
Green tea.
And green tea. It's just in the back, and so it's kind of reception. We can all chat, and if you have some more questions for Dennis, then there's another opportunity to ask them. So thank you everyone for coming. I hope you enjoyed it.